For a while, I didn't want to make this video. A top 10 films of the year list is far from an original concept, and I didn't know what I could add to the conversation about one of the best film years in recent memory. But that's when my reason came. This is undoubtedly one of the best film years in recent memory. I'm talking about 10 movies today, but there were many more that left me excited and thrilled after watching them. The films this year were electric, reinvigorating, reminding me of why I love movies and what they can be capable of. I'll spare you the preamble. You know what we're doing here. 10 movies ranked from 10th to 1st. I loved them all, though. There will be no spoilers, so you're in safe hands. But let me show my cards a bit and explain that I haven't seen every film of the year. Of course not. Knowing my sensibilities, I've come up with a list of 10 more films that might have made this list had I simply gotten around to watching them. But beyond those, I did watch most major releases of the year, and I feel incredibly happy with the list we've got. So, let's start with...
Sad news, I will not be doing piercings anymore in the hut, because there's a narc amongst us. Cassie has narked. It's totally fine.
Theater Camp is probably the deepest cut in my entire top 10, and I'll admit it's a film I didn't even plan to see. I had heard about it in passing, but I didn't really have any interest. However, one of my friends really wanted to see it, and I reluctantly tagged along. And I'm very glad I did. I've mentioned in past videos that, in my opinion, the peak of comedy is the mockumentary. It's the only format that balances subtle jokes with the absurdity of life itself. Mockumentaries are often exaggerated, sure, but they're based on real life. Theater Camp is no exception. It follows a group of children at their annual summer theater camp, and the problems that arise when their longtime director falls into a coma. The budget is clearly low, but that's arguably Theater Camp's big strength. It's abundantly clear that every child actor in this film is the exact kid they're portraying, and it turns a fictional film into something that feels entirely real. The adult actors are fun too, with many of them being well-known Broadway figures or character actors. You can tell they're all having a good time, and for some of them, their lines probably hit a little close to home. Theater Camp is more than just a comedy, but its heartfelt moments don't do much for me. I'm glad they exist, but this works best when it parodies a life I'm familiar with. When it goes further and tries to pull heartstrings or cause applause, it lost me. It didn't lose my theater, though. I saw this at an AMC upon its initial limited release, and my theater was full. Genuinely full, to the point where me and my friends were sitting right at the front of the full house. And Theater Camp found its audience for sure, because our group of viewers was crying and clapping and cheering. When Nicole Kidman's ads started playing, people gave a standing ovation. One guy even stood up and recited the entire monologue, word by word, while saluting Kidman. Make of that what you will. I think Theater Camp is almost too niche. I was in theater as a kid, but these jokes really get into the weeds at times and went over my head. Still, when jokes land, they really land. And these are nitpicks for an ultimately surprisingly fun time. Unless you can really relate to the material, this won't blow you out of the water, but I really enjoyed it more than I expected to, and I'm glad I was reluctantly dragged to see it. I'm somewhat conflicted on Poor Things. Let's start with the good. No, great. Poor Things is a visual treat. I am convinced Yorgos Lanthimos is on an entirely different plane when it comes to staging and shooting a scene. He isn't even better at it, per se, but he's certainly going about filmmaking in an entirely different way than everyone else. Poor Things is also extremely well acted, with Emma Stone again proving she is one of our best working actresses. And Willem Dafoe and Mark Ruffalo certainly do their best to keep up. This film makes my top 10 solely on its imagery and inventiveness and courage to boldly do whatever it wants. Lanthimos seems so unaware of the larger film movements that it's funny. He continues to make movies that feel neither modern nor ancient. His movies are just his, and that's all there is to it. The score, the editing, the sound mixing, all great. Here's my issue with Poor Things. It all just feels a tad misguided. This is a somewhat unique take on the story of Frankenstein's monster, portrayed by an entirely out there Emma Stone. Her motivation to find love is certainly realistic, but the whole movie just feels a bit gross. Poor Things is funny, and it is cool, and it tries to say something meaningful about being a woman in a male-dominated world. But it just feels a bit off base at times, I guess. I think Stone could have played her role with a bit more nuance, and that writer Tony McNamara could have written a bit more for her to do. Beyond those faults, though, I still had a really good time with Poor Things, and I'd certainly watch it again. I mean, Dafoe's facial prosthetics alone are just infinitely cooler than like 90% of anything most films do, and Poor Things is literally 130 minutes of smart people doing fun things on camera. When Poor Things works, it's my movie of the year. But there are about 5 or 6 scenes that don't work, and it's enough to push the film to the lower half of my best of list.
Hey, Felix, is everything okay?
Yes. Why?
You seem annoyed about something.
It seems like every few months, there's a film that's labeled as shocking or wild, and you've got to see it for yourself because it's that crazy. I mean, this is pretty clearly a marketing tactic, but I will say that I've really grown to dislike films that are crazy for the sake of being crazy. Saltburn was labeled as such, and so I went into it with fairly tempered expectations. Now that I've seen it, I'll be the first to admit that this film is not all that wild. Sure, it maybe goes a little further than we're used to, but it's honestly a pretty straightforward narrative about a guy who becomes enamored with what and who the Saltburn estate has to offer. It's told conventionally. It even holds itself back at times. Emerald Fennell directs and writes the film, and while I still prefer her debut, Promising Young Woman, she's proving that she's a pretty promising young filmmaker herself. I'll watch anything she does going forward. Saltburn is among the most confident films of the year. Every decision Fennell makes might convince you she's been around the block for years, and that confidence results in a film that is so sure of its decisions that you can't help but smile, even if you consider them the wrong ones. Saltburn is a film about lust and greed and opulence, and it shares all of its themes in ways that seem designed to get you to talk. This is a film you've got to have an opinion on, and I loved it. What I want from a movie is to feel something. If I watch a comedy, make me laugh. If I watch horror, I want to be scared. I squirmed during Saltburn pretty much every 10 minutes. And it's because every scene twists and turns like a snake that always stays on target. This is not absurd or wild for the sake of it. It's a well-crafted statement on greed that got exactly what it wanted from me. It's not a film I can really review without spoiling, which I'm committed to not doing, but I will say that Saltburn is another unforgettable movie in a year full of them, and its music, sets, performances, and scenes will leave you feeling something. You're either going to love or hate this, and I hope that's enticing enough to convince you to find out for yourself.
Shomikasi. That's how you are.
I don't know what you said, but it must have been Indian for handsome devil.
As soon as I first heard that Martin Scorsese was going to be making his version of a Western, starring Leo and De Niro and Jesse Plemons, and based on the novel Killers of the Flower Moon, I was incredibly excited. So excited, in fact, that I read Killers of the Flower Moon. That was late 2020, and 3 years later, the book still impacts me. It's a great story, expertly researched by David Grann, and a fitting tribute to such a tragic story. Grann's book follows Tom White, an investigator sent to Osage County to investigate a string of murders. It's written as a murder mystery of sorts, with the readers being completely in the dark as to who is killing the Osage. Overall, it's a great book, and I think it is better than Scorsese's film. Scorsese's film changes the perspective of the story, instead following Ernest Burkhart, who is played pretty brilliantly by Leonardo DiCaprio in his best performance since The Wolf of Wall Street, probably. The genre shifts too. It's no longer a mystery, and the audience is let in on who is killing the Osage almost immediately. Unfortunately, I don't think any changes done here really helped the film. They certainly beef up DiCaprio's role. He was almost a minor character in the book, but every benefit done for DiCaprio here is done at the expense of others. Molly, Ernest's wife, sees her role greatly diminished, and Plemons is almost a glorified cameo. It's a shame that such a rich story went through so many changes, but Killers of the Flower Moon is still an exhilarating film. For starters, despite being told through a white lens, this is probably the most care that a Hollywood film has ever shown Native American tribes. Apparently, the entire Osage community contributed to this film, from language coordinators to designing the sets and costumes. This is a period piece of 1920s America, and I think it is among the most accurate the period has ever been represented. Killers of the Flower Moon absorbs you. Once you settle in and start to hear the drums of the Osage people as they dance through an oil shower, you're in. At least I was. Despite knowing exactly what would happen next at every turn, I was transfixed, and every aspect of the film seemed to work in harmony to produce a truly moving, poignant love letter to one of the great tragedies of American history. And there's still so much story left to tell. The film is a long 3.5 hours, and it really feels it at times, especially in the back half. I don't wish Killers of the Flower Moon was shorter, but I would love to see this in the miniseries format it so clearly was meant to be told in. Still, there's so much to appreciate here. Lily Gladstone disappears into the role of Molly, and I wish we got more of her. Again, my biggest fault here is that there is just too much of DiCaprio. I've never been a huge DiCaprio fan, and I think his ego can often be the undoing of some of his works. Killers of the Flower Moon still really works, in large part due to Scorsese and Gladstone and production designer Jack Fisk and composer Robbie Robertson, but I just feel this could have been even better. Still, it's clearly one of my favorite films of the year, and I'll be rooting for it come Oscar season. We've never seen such a nuanced love letter to the Osage people. And in a year full of unique perspectives, this is one of the richest.
Now feel.
The year's highest grossing film is also one of my favorites, something that is usually never the case. Typically, for a film to make as much money as Barbie did, it's got to appeal to an extremely wide net of people. It likely goes broad in its strokes, which doesn't do much for me when I'm looking for a film that deeply connects with me. However, Barbie is just so much fun. I've talked a bit already about theatrical experiences and how 2023 was full of great ones, and Barbie was no exception. Theaters all over the world put life-sized Barbie boxes in lobbies, allowing people to get photos while dressed in pink. And the pink, in my lifetime, I can't remember a film where everyone just collectively agreed they were going to wear a specific color and go all out with it. A movie theater is, by design, an isolating place. Ideally, you're not paying attention to the people around you when you watch what you bought tickets for. But Barbie was an experience more than just a movie, and it's the first true event of a film since the start of the pandemic. I had forgotten how much I missed that collective experience. It also doesn't hurt that Barbie is genuinely a very good film. The music is so catchy. There are 3 songs from Barbie alone that are in discussions for an Oscar. And the vernacular from the movie has already entered into larger conversations. The sets and costumes were fully realized with a distinct visual style that was absolutely nailed. The performances, especially by Margot Robbie and Ryan Gosling, were incredibly solid. And while I don't think either was truly worthy of an Oscars win, both actors put their all into this film. Everyone did. This is one of those movies where you can tell the people working on it knew they were working on something special. Nobody is phoning it in. The message of how hard it is to be a woman is definitely a very important one. I still consider Little Women my favorite of Greta Gerwig's works, and I think Little Women has the same message of how hard it is to be a woman, but I think that work says it much more effectively, with more nuance and deeper understanding. But Gerwig herself has explained why Barbie's message is so heavy-handed, claiming she wanted to leave absolutely no room for potential misinterpretation. It's a fine reasoning, and Barbie's message is certainly admirable. I do think, though, that the movie sacrifices nuance repeatedly to avoid miscommunication. Every film in my top 10 is nuanced, with Barbie as the sole exception. And while I don't hold it against Gerwig or her writing and life partner Noah Baumbach, it does hurt the film slightly in my estimation. Barbie is a movie for the masses, and it's super inspiring to see such a visually inventive and creative and unique film appeal to such a wide subsection of the world. There's not a ton I could take from watching Barbie over and over again, but ultimately, that's fine. This is a really fun movie, and sometimes that's all that something needs to be. I will always bet on Hayao Miyazaki. In high school, my brother and I did a watch through of this, at the time, complete box set of every one of his films, and it still remains one of my favorite movie marathons I've ever done. Since then, I've seen most of those films a second, third, fourth, or even 10th time in the case of Ponyo or My Neighbor Totoro. If I were to plot every Miyazaki movie on a bar graph with fantasy as the x-axis and adventure on the y-axis, I can pretty clearly determine that most of my favorite Miyazakis are medium fantasy, low adventure. The Boy and the Heron is closer on the graph to the high fantasy, high adventure films, which is a pretty great thing clearly as I've got it this high for the year. But I won't lie and say that I wanted a bit less fantasy and a bit less adventure. By the time the third act rolls around and most of the plot points reach their discordant climax, I was more interested in the score than what was happening on screen. And of course, let's talk about the score. I love Miyazaki's themes of nature and adolescence, but my favorite through line of all of his work is his longtime collaborator, Joe Hisaishi. Hisaishi's score here is maybe his best ever, and I really don't say that lightly. I can't include too much of it at the risk of copyright infringement, but it is a beautiful mix of his signature piano and sweeping strings. It's a score fit for Miyazaki's final masterpiece, and I'm so glad I was able to see it on the big screen. More than the sum of its parts, The Boy and the Heron is a poignant farewell from the greatest director to ever work in animation. In 2013, Miyazaki retired with The Wind Rises, a deeply personal tribute to airplanes and aviation, another defining theme for Miyazaki. But with The Boy and the Heron, Miyazaki gives us a perhaps self-indulgent tribute to art and mentorship, and arguably a tribute to himself. It's rare that we can see such personal stories told with such care and reverence, and while I'd argue Miyazaki may have lost the plot more than a few times, you've gotta forgive large leaps if it means we land on specific steps. The creativity is there. The animation, come on, the animation is there. This is not an aging filmmaker appeasing the masses with one last run around. This is a master of filmmaking painting the screen with a work that fits amongst his filmography like a glove. The biggest compliment I can give to The Boy and the Heron is that it feels like it has always existed. My box set was just somehow missing it. But it has finally been uncovered, and it's a film I hope to never forget.
Now I am become death, the destroyer of worlds. I suppose we all thought that, one way or another.
Oppenheimer is a film that I've gone back and forth on a lot since seeing it in July, and ultimately a top 5 spot seems about right. To start with a few minor critiques, I still don't think Christopher Nolan understands women. Or rather, he's just not that interested in them. Emily Blunt's Catherine is maybe the strongest female character in any of his works, and even she is continuously shafted to make room for more of Oppenheimer's internal struggles. People have been calling Christopher Nolan out about this issue for years, but I find it particularly more egregious in the context of Barbenheimer. If you watch Barbie first and see how that film treats women, and then go to Oppenheimer, the difference is striking. One oft-repeated stat is that it takes 20 minutes for a woman to get a single line, and then, 1 minute later, she's having sex with our lead. That is an egregious oversight, and it's worth calling out. But I still have Oppenheimer as a top 5 film of the year. Why? It's a really good movie. Like Killers of the Flower Moon, its pacing could use a bit of work. Seriously, these editors need to be a bit more ruthless in trimming and chopping. But beyond that, I find it to be an almost perfect movie. It's insanely gripping, especially in theaters. Nolan's films have always excelled in that aspect, and while I'll always prefer story and script over sound mixing and editing, Oppenheimer is pretty much a masterclass in the latter. The performances are also being rightly lauded as career best for pretty much every actor, though Florence Pugh's career best will always be Little Women, and she totally should have got the Oscar for that. But it feels redundant to praise Oppenheimer for the same things every critic with a Twitter account has been saying for months. One of the reasons the top films of the year list is so exciting is due in part to the fact that films can often go much beyond their silver screen borders. I didn't just see Oppenheimer in a theater in July. I saw Oppenheimer in memes. I saw Oppenheimer on t-shirts, and I saw its dual release date with Barbie take the world by storm in one of the most fun months of moviegoing I have ever lived through. My favorite part of Oppenheimer has nothing to do with its test sequence or final lines. I love how unpredictable its success was. I've been known to bemoan the death of movies for a few years now, and while that is certainly a tad dramatic, it should not be forgotten how genuinely impressive Oppenheimer's success is. This film is a 3-hour biopic on J. Robert Oppenheimer in 2023. And that film made nearly $1 billion. For all of the talk about movie theaters dying, Oppenheimer and the Barbenheimer phenomenon should be celebrated. Films from extremely competent filmmakers performing at heights that are completely unexpected. One thing that we do on this channel a lot is examine Oscar ceremonies. I've always felt that more than an indicator of the year's best films, the Oscars is an indicator of that year through films. It's a pretty important distinction, and while I don't think Oppenheimer would be my best picture, if it does end up winning the top prize at this year's ceremony, I think it's the perfect best picture for 2023. It reminds us that people will see good movies, and that name recognition alone is not enough. As someone who loves movies, it makes me so genuinely excited to see Christopher Nolan course correct so hard from Tenet and come back with one of the best films of the year. More than a great movie, Oppenheimer is a look at the past and a promise of the future, and I'm so glad that it exists.
Oh! Presto, Cherry's Jubilee.
Ooh. Shouldn't it just go out?
When I first saw the trailer for The Holdovers, it didn't do much for me. I thought it seemed a bit disjointed and a bit too in love with the 1970s. Style over substance, I guessed. But 2023 has been the year of film surprises, and The Holdovers was one of my biggest. The writing in this film is superb. This is writer David Hemingson's first screenplay to be turned into a feature, and one look at his IMDb shows a long, labored career of writing subpar television, and assumingly waiting for his big break. I am so happy for him that his script became a reality and that it was made with so much care and attention to detail. What I called a love letter to the 70s could be more aptly described as an actual, real-life 1970s film, because you cannot tell that this was made in 2023. It is shot in grainy film with low, natural lighting. Its pacing is slower, too, enveloping you in the world of this New England prep school with the intensity of a warm, gentle hug. The Holdovers follows the students and staff of Barton Academy, a fictional academy at the cusp of winter break. Most students go home for the holidays, but there are a select few, the Holdovers, that have nowhere to go. Paul Giamatti plays an English professor with the unfortunate task of watching this group of kids, and it's in part because he has nowhere to go either. But The Breakfast Club this is not. It's tough to explain the appeal of The Holdovers without describing it as gentle, which is such an odd adjective to describe a film. Like I said, it's a warm hug of a film. There is conflict, of course, but it's quiet conflict. One of our key characters is Divine Joy Randolph's Mary Lamb, the school's head cook that is silently mourning the loss of her young son in the Vietnam War. At one moment, her grief reaches its breaking point. A lesser film would show this moment in a shouting match with God, where Lamb curses the world, crying and giving the most performance instead of the best one. Not The Holdovers. Mary's grief is quiet, lonely, devastating. That's what The Holdovers is full of. Every time the plot advances forward, we pull back. The camera watches from a safe distance, and you feel as though you've stepped into a scene that you weren't supposed to see. It is so rare to see a film like The Holdovers, because a film like this needs such a mature cast and crew. The humor feels earned, the twists unexpected. Characters are sweet when they feel like being sweet, and snippy when they're feeling snippy. Nobody is one note here, and it's such a refreshing look at people that, for all intents and purposes, we should be pitying. But if you pity these characters, you're missing the point. This is a movie about togetherness and the inherent good in everyone. In 2023, it's needed. If you pass on The Holdovers, I strongly urge you to check it out. It's one of the best films of the year, or at the very least, one of the kindest.
You know, you only speak in Korean when you talk in your sleep. You dream in a language that I can't understand. It's like there's this whole place inside of you where I can't go.
It seems like every year there's a film that makes it through the festival circuit right at the beginning of the year, and then said film is still in discussions come Oscar season. Past Lives was this year's version of that phenomenon, meaning that I had known about it for about 9 months before I was finally able to see it earlier this month. These 9 months have been filled with people raving about how good, monumental Past Lives is. And so I was worried that it might not hold up to these impossible expectations. I can confidently and gladly say that my fears were unfounded. Past Lives is the feature film debut of Celine Song, and what a confident and powerful debut it is. The film follows Nora, a Korean immigrant living in New York City, when she receives word that her best friend and first love from childhood, Hae Sung, will be visiting for a few days on vacation. It is an incredibly simple concept, but one that is full of devastating realizations about timing and fate and beliefs. There is so much to love here. The film opens on a scene of Nora, Hae Sung, and a third character in a bar. Across the room, 2 bar patrons play a game where they try to discern the story of these 3 strangers. They make several guesses, and we are as in the dark as they are as to which is correct. And then, Song starts to fill in the pieces. It's the type of opening that makes you want to sit down and write a screenplay yourself, because Celine Song clearly knows what she's doing, and you've got some catching up to do. More confident, creative, deep wells of scenes soon follow. There's one great meta sequence halfway through that calls out both the audience's expectations, as well as throws into question what type of film this is. Past Lives is loosely based on the real life of Song, a fact so devastating that I immediately respect her more for sharing such a personal story to millions. To talk about Past Lives without spoiling it is difficult, but I can say with confidence that this is a film you need to see. Beyond the technical artistry and strong performances and yada yada yada, Past Lives says something completely unique about soulmates and destiny that I have never seen a film say, but that feels so true. It's funny, I watched this film with my girlfriend, and we didn't cry during it. It is sad, sure, but no tears fell. When the credits rolled, though, we began to talk about what we just watched, and it suddenly became all the more sadder. Despite being an incredibly straightforward 100-minute film, Past Lives is an onion of trauma, with each layer, like an onion, bringing more tears. It only took about 5 minutes of discussing the film for tears to fall. It's so rare that a film can elicit such a visceral reaction from me. One sequence right at the end involving an Uber almost made me want to pause the player, turn the movie off, and write my own ending. I wrote in my Letterboxd review that Past Lives had a few decisions I probably would have written differently, but I realized they're probably the wrong ones. This is a film about our existence, and that can often be a really messy place. It doesn't matter if you can relate to Nora in any way. Past Lives is universal, and you need to give it a shot.
Pop tried to protect us with wrestling. He said if we were the toughest, the strongest, nothing had ever hurt us. I believed him. We all did.
And we end this with the most numbing film of the year. The Iron Claw is based on the true story of the Von Erichs, a multi-generational wrestling family that saw their chances at fame sabotaged by tragedy. I've never been a wrestling guy, and so their names did nothing for me. But I've always loved wrestling and film. Beyond the put-upon glamour and showy performances, wrestling is one of the most intimate sports out there, and it translates brilliantly to a more grounded film medium. This movie is phenomenal in all aspects, but the wrestling sequences are as well shot as anything I've seen. Bodies fly past the camera, in and out of focus as we linger on sweat dripping and fists landing. Unlike the holdovers, which pulls back, the Iron Claw zooms in, daring us to look away from a sport we can't possibly comprehend. But we don't. I must have audibly oohed several times during the wrestling sequences, wincing at low blows and earned victories. But I couldn't look away. Pulling us in is what the Iron Claw excels at, due in no small part to some absurd performances from an ensemble cast. I knew Jeremy Allen White was a good actor, but come on! Holt McCallany is brilliant as Fritz von Erich, the domineering father figure that you will hate come closing credits. He is so icy and calculated in this role. Maura Tierney was also really good. She's not getting much attention online, but she played Fritz's wife, Doris, with a forced restraint that is really difficult to nail. She is so pained in every scene, and you can't help but hate her for entirely different reasons than Fritz. And Zac Efron. I didn't think Efron was ever a bad actor, but I didn't know he was this good. This is a star-making performance if I've ever seen one, and I hope he lands role after role moving forward. The Iron Claw really nails its ideas of masculinity and how dangerous masculinity can be. A strong script and direction helps that, but the real kicker here that makes this entire film work is that our leading men are so shockingly tender. The Iron Claw follows 4 Von Erich brothers, and their interactions are often highlighted by shows of affection, kindness, kisses and hugs, and helping hands. These men are the exact opposite of what their bodies indicate, and director Sean Durkin spends time visually to highlight this distinction. We spend just as much time on sweat dripping as we do tears shedding, just as much on cursing and anger as we do words of love and affirmation. You just don't see this type of relationship in film. If you're noticing any sorts of trends in what types of film I love, it's ones that are full of emotion and power, but more unique in how they choose to share this emotion. I love films about family, about love, films that are well shot and well written, and the Iron Claw has all of this. I saw a great review on Letterboxd by user Kinsey Vanunu, describing the Iron Claw as Little Women for boys, and I think that's actually a perfect encapsulation. If the Iron Claw was simply a movie about passion and how wrestlers abuse their bodies to reach top prizes, it would still be effective, sure, but in between these moments of blood and taunting and losses and wins, we see the Von Erichs dance at weddings, sneak out to a frat party, play football in their backyard. That's what makes this movie work. More than any other film this year, I cared deeply about the Von Erichs and wanted desperately for only the best for them. Every character is given at least 2 or 3 scenes that are entirely their own. The Von Erich tapestry is woven in just over 2 hours, and by the end of the film, my theater was collectively breathless. I want to end this video by saying that this year was full of moments like that. Moments that left me breathless and laughing and crying and smiling and scared. 2023 has been my favorite year for movies since 2019. And it's been such a treat to cover so many of my favorites today. The range of voices in my top 10 is maybe the most diverse it has ever been, and that's super exciting. We've got films from 5 different countries, 11 different directors, stories that are completely different, and more importantly, original. I know with 2024 on the horizon and the after effects of a strike still largely unseen, we might be looking at a slight dip next year. But if the movies are right, I'll come back with another top 10 then. We're coming up on the 1-year anniversary of this channel, and while we're still learning exactly what people want to see, it's pretty cool that I can share my love of movies to people who actually want to listen. If you're subscribed, I really appreciate it. And if you're not subscribed, get on it. I'm just kidding, obviously, but seriously, thank you for watching and joining our growing community. We've got tons of videos of all different sizes in the works. Expect more Oscars videos, more classic film videos, more disturbing films, and let us know what you want more of. There are millions of stories that deserve to be told, and I love being able to help tell them. Thanks for watching, and until the next time, I'll see you at the movies.